China has a lot of people involved in Canada that is trying to gain access and influence to your government, and they've been very effective. And I worry they're going to be more effective the longer that Mr. Trudeau remains in power and that his party does.
I am a husband, a father, a lawyer, a Christian, and a proud Canadian. I started this series because it was clear that our nation needs truth. Not just another biased narrative, but real information of substance. We need access to facts and the freedom to think for ourselves. I'm Leighton Gray, and this is Gray Matter.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. Well, as every Canadian knows, or everyone in Canada should know, China has become an infiltration force in our political structures, in really all of our institutions. And this is a matter of grave concern. In fact, there's going to be a public inquiry at some point now in Canada, now that our special rapporteur has resigned. So we thought it would be useful to have someone on the show who knows a lot about China. And we've been able to do that. We have Brandon Weichert on the program, and he is a specialist in this area, a geopolitical analyst, who's written a really, really fascinating book that I highly recommend. It's called Biohacked: China's Race to Control Life. And you could substitute life for everything, because the book goes well beyond just the DNA and the science of it. So welcome to the program, Brandon. It's great to have you on Gray Matter today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for you're correct in your assessment that it is more than life. It's the entire world that they want to control in China.
Yeah. So we're going to get into it, and we're going to introduce you properly. Before we do that, on our program, we do something a little bit different. We have some framing aphorisms, and I think you'll probably appreciate these. They've been selected in your honor. The first one is from Xi Jinping, who said, well, in Chinese, and I expect this has been translated, if the machinery for distribution in the present economic system of the world is incapable of properly distributing the productive wealth of nations, then that system is false and must be altered. Secondly, Vladimir Putin, who said, of course, again in Russian translated, people are always teaching us democracy, but the people who teach us democracy don't want to learn it themselves. We conclude Justin Trudeau in that one. And then finally, Donald Trump, who is the subject of one of your books, who said, we should have a new force called the Space Force. It's like the Army and the Navy, but for space, because we're spending a lot of money on space. That's sort of a typical Donald Trump soundbite. So who do we have in the show today? Well, it's Brandon Weichert. He is a prolific writer who is a contributing editor to American Greatness, the Asia Times, and the Washington Times. He's a former congressional staffer who holds an MA in Statecraft and National Security Affairs from the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C., and he manages the Weichert Report, World News Done Right. I like that name. He splits his time between sunny Southwest Florida, where he is today, and bucolic Northern Virginia. He's also the author of Biohack. This is one of the books that he's written that we're going to talk about today. Biohack: China's Race to Control Life. So, Brandon, I know this isn't your first book, but what was it that drew you to this particular topic? Why did you write this book?
It's a personal connection to me. So, first of all, my wife is a geneticist by training. She worked at National Institute of Health. She was part of the chain of command with Francis Collins and Anthony Fauci. So there's that. Also, I do a lot of consulting work for the Defense Department, the U.S. Defense Department, specifically the Air Force. And I really talk to them about geotechnology, so the confluence of new high technology and how it's going to impact international security. And biotech was one of the things that I always talked about. And it was just something that always interested me. And then lastly, I suffer from a very severe autoimmune disease. And so I have a lot of dealings with the medical community on a personal basis. So those three factors really made this sort of a personal journey for me. And the experience of COVID-19, I know I have a couple of friends from Canada who say that you think you had it bad in America with the lockdowns. Try sitting in Canada during the lockdown. So I know that Canada had it worse in many respects, but here in America, we we really did not handle the disease very well. And I wanted to know why it happened. And I wanted to understand how our government and our institutions could be so improper in their use of force against their own people. And so that was sort of the
Yeah.
genesis of this book.
Yeah. So there's the part about what China did, which is becoming more and more well known. I think now everybody realizes, or should realize, is that
Not
this.
everybody.
Well, they should know that this thing came from a lab in China. Everybody except Anthony Fauci knows that, it seems. But your book was somewhat unique in the way it got into the sort of appalling, egregious way that that China's rulers sought to cover this up. That's one part of it.
Yeah.
And then the other part of it is the way that those our rulers, our experts in the West, bought into this. All of this was really egregious. Were you surprised when you did your research, sort of the extent of that in the West we participated in China's plan?
Yeah, it didn't surprise me necessarily. It was more appalling, and it was sort of a letdown because you have to understand, not only does my wife actually spend years working at that institution in the NIH, I spent a long time in government as well, and I can tell you
Right.
horror stories of how incompetent our government is. But it's one thing to say we're incompetent, and that's just part of life. But it's another thing when you look at it and you go, "My goodness, there were very important and powerful entities within our government that were actually engaged in what looks like a cover-up, to cover up, to shield their culpability." In what were really risky experiments, particularly with with coronavirus research, but more generally, they're continuing and have continued to do risky research with a whole plethora of different aspects of biotechnology in China. And when I asked, and I quote him from an article that he was involved with, the leading Stanford bioethicist, who's one of these legendary figures in the American medical community. He's quoted in my book,
Right.
basically saying that, hey, yeah, we have the Hippocratic Oath, which is the first do no harm as medical practitioners and researchers. But the trump card with that, there's a caveat. The trump card is always cures. And so while we're going to not do harm, we will happily partner with a country like China that will do harm. We won't participate directly in those experiments. We'll fund them maybe, but we'll reap the benefits of it. And that the trump card is, in terms of ethics, is, hey, we got the cure for, you name the disease. And to me, that's just not worth it. It's really not.
Yeah. In that case, Trump is a bit of a play on words, given
It is, I
Operation
guess.
Warp
Yes, isn't it?
Speed. Well,
Yes.
but this is much broader than just the pandemic. For example,
Absolutely.
I know that you're aware of this. You said off camera that you've actually consulted with Canadian authorities on the influence of China. But what has been revealed in Canada, I don't know if you've been following this in your country, but there is now proven, documented interference by China in each of our last two national elections in 2019 and 2021. And in fact, there's a paper trail showing that they specifically supported the party that has been kept in power, that has been imposing essentially policies that many Canadians disagree with, that are right out of the World Economic Forum UN 2030 agenda, that seems to be shall I say, the tip of the whip of Chinese hegemony in the world. So and part of what you talk about in the book is, we talk about China's race to control life, but really it's China's race to control everything, isn't it?
Right. And they're starting with the literal building blocks of life, and they're working up from there. They're scaling up. The important thing to note, so what I didn't directly consult with the Canadian government. What happened was I was brought into a U.S. base that had a Canadian contingent.
Right.
And I briefed both elements, but I was not brought in by the Canadian government. But while I was talking, afterward, we do this little confab afterward where I sort of chat with the top leaders. It's sort of informal, but the lead general there was retiring. He was the Canadian contingent general, and he came up to me and he basically just started complaining about how much influence China has, and he said, "You can't depend on us as long as you know who's in charge in Canada."
Yeah.
And I said, I got it. And he said, "No, I'm not just saying because I disagree with him politically. He said, I'm saying because I think this guy is compromised and I think his party is. And then, of course, now you have these reports of actual paper trails. And so if you look at what China's doing in terms of Canada, it's not just Canada, it's other elements of the Five Eyes. So the Five Eyes is the very powerful intelligence sharing network, United States, Canada, Britain, New Zealand, Australia. That goes back to the Cold War. It's one of the reasons why we were able to stay competitive with the Soviet Union and beat them was that Five Eyes alliance. That Five Eyes alliance is a threat to China now, or at least that's what China thinks. So they're targeting individual members of the Five Eyes, the weakest members they think. And I'm sorry to say Canada is one of those weakest members in their eyes. The other one is New Zealand. And so if you look at what they're doing in Canada, they're doing the same thing in New Zealand.
Yes.
They were trying to do it in Australia, and it was working until COVID. And then COVID was unleashed, and it was the Australians who said, no, this came from a lab, and we want you to tell us why. And then suddenly Australia became one of the most hawkish members of the Anglo Alliance against China. But Canada and New Zealand, unfortunately, are viewed as the low-hanging fruit that China will pluck, and they are. And China has a lot of people involved in Canada that is trying to gain access and influence to your government, and they've been very effective, and I worry they're going to be more effective the longer that Mr. Trudeau remains in power and that his party does.
Yeah, in fact, there's a woman who is the leading candidate in the polls to become the new mayor of Toronto, and many people are saying that she is in fact a Chinese asset.
Yes, I've heard this.
This weakness of Canada in the eyes of China, perhaps the world. Do you suspect that's part of the reason why Canada and New Zealand are being shut out of some of these new military alliances?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's 100%. It's a self-defense thing. And, it's very scary from a U.S. perspective because you've always been our peace. Well, not always, I should say.
World's longest unguarded border. Yeah.
Yes. But I mean, there is a history that precedes the 20th century in which Canada and the United States were not on friendly terms.
Yes.
And in a worst case scenario, it could go back to that where we were a bit frigid toward each other.
Yeah.
I remember in 2016, I was part of a group when President Trump was elected. We were talking about building a proverbial wall, not just to the south, but to the north, because at the time I was saying we have a lot of issues with Al-Qaeda and ISIS members sneaking across our open border with Canada. They come into Toronto, they sort of hang out there, then they come into our open border with the north. And then I was saying also there's a lot of Chinese mafia, Chinese organized crime interests that are doing the business of China's government, and they're destabilizing our northern border. I got a lot of flack from that. In fact, I got into it with a guy from near government, the defense ministry, on Dan Damon's BBC show. But it's been a problem for at least 5 to 6 years, and it's not getting any better. And so I hate to say this, but we are going to need to start looking at Canada with a little bit more trepidation than I think we'd like to.
Yeah, I know Tucker Carlson, for one, has been drawing a lot of attention to it. One of the interesting things about Biohacked, your book, coming back to it, is you actually propose, you don't just talk about problems, you actually have a solution.
Thank you for saying that, yes.
You said in order to stop the threat, that you propose that the world's nations create a comprehensive set of treaties for regulating biotechnology research and development. Do you want to talk about this a little bit? Because this is something that it was unique to your book and some of the other ones I've read about China and about COVID, that you're actually proposing boots on the ground solutions.
Yeah. And so I just want to say as a quick preface to that, thank you for saying that, because for so long when I do these public talks, the media people want to fixate on the heavy stuff I write about, which is the doom and gloom, the problem. They never talk about how always in my work in the back half, I try to provide solutions. It's all they want to talk about is all the problems I'm talking about. So thank you for opening that.
I actually did read the book.
I know you did. I know. And I really appreciate that because, yes, I do propose actual solutions, and these are tangible solutions. These are not pie in the sky. So one of the things that I propose in the book is I identify one of the biggest problems we have with China is the fact that so many US-based tech firms in order to gain access, and this is true in the biotech, but it's all technology areas. So it's not just biotech, it's quantum, it's AI, it's traditional computing, it's all of those high tech areas. In order for those US based firms to obtain access to China's market share, the Chinese Communist Party requires those companies to hand over proprietary intellectual property, and or I should say exclusive intellectual property. And these companies see only dollar signs, and so they happily do that, not really caring or realizing that what they're doing is effectively feeding the crocodile, hoping that it'll
Right.
eat them last.
Right.
But ultimately, it will eat them. And so, what I propose is it doesn't require military action. And I say this to the military audiences, and they look at me dumbfounded. I say, it doesn't require bullets and bombs. It just requires Congress, which I know is a problem. It requires Congress to simply redesignate all or most tech transfers as bribes under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And once you've designated those as bribes, you now will probably cut at least in half those tech transfers, because these companies are doing these tech transfers not just to make money, but because there's no barrier to them. So if the
Right.
Department of Justice were to raise those barriers to them, suddenly at least half of those companies would at the very least slow down the tech transfers, probably stop them, because risk increases. And when you increase risk on businesses, particularly big high tech ones, they don't want to deal with the headache, so they just won't do it at all. They might
Right.
find new ways to work around the rules, but that's one big thing we can do is reclassifying those tech transfers as bribes under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Right. So this is interesting because you sort of segued into another topic I wanted to canvass with you, and that is this idea of let's say rampant corruption in government. The deep
Yeah.
state. The blob, whatever whatever
Yeah.
euphemism you want to give it. This is a problem that is very serious in Canada, as we talked about, but also. The erosion of the rule of law is also something that is very concerning that you touch upon somewhat in your book, because that's really what China is all about, is disrupting the rule of law
Right.
in opposing nations. Right now in the United States, a former president, the most recent president, who is
Right.
let's say the front runner or the main opponent to President Biden in the next election, is being indicted.
Yeah.
And I wonder, is there a connection between, for example, China and foreign influence or global influence and this unprecedented, or correct me if I'm wrong, this is an unprecedented situation where the reigning government's main political opponent is actually being taken out through a state-led prosecution.
Yeah. So the first thing I will say is that I believe that the charges against former President Trump, and I say this as a Floridian, I like DeSantis, but I like Trump as well. I supported Trump when he was president, no questions asked. But it is obvious that these are politically charged investigations. It's very Banana Republic-ish,
Right.
but I don't mean the clothing store. So, this is not something that I would have ever believed in the darkest days of my life being in America, and I'm a millennial. I'm on the
Right.
older side, but I'm a millennial. But we've had scandals in this country, and it's nothing like what we're experiencing now. And it should be noted that yes, technically, when it comes to the classified documents, it does look like Donald Trump did break some rules, but it's unfathomable to think that this would be going on with any other president. Furthermore, that this is going on when the sitting president, Joe Biden, had actually engaged in the same behavior for far longer for his,
Yeah.
1,000 years in government, that he's, the guy's older than George Washington. So it's disgusting to me, this double standard. And I think most Americans, and I'm sure Canadians looking from afar, are probably seeing this as absolutely disgusting. Even if you hate Donald Trump, this should be appalling. Not because he shouldn't necessarily get a slap on the wrist or something, but because they're clearly throwing the book at him. when the other guy that he's running against is not having anything happen to him. And you brought up China, and so I'm going to work this in here. I'm also a senior editor at a website called 1945.com, and I have been one of the people uncovering this Hunter Biden, global influence
Right.
peddling scheme.
Right.
And the first thing that I became convinced by is that Joe Biden and that entire family, I call them the Biden syndicate. The Biden syndicate has been completely bought and paid for by the Chinese government. And
Right.
so I believe that the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping in particular, is very much afraid generally of a Republican getting back into office. But specifically, I think they have a real jag against President Trump. And I think they loosed COVID-19 in part because Trump had effectively waged a trade war on China in 2019. And I think now to keep him out of office, they're having their Manchurian candidate, Joe Biden, the president who mentally isn't there, basically be their puppet in going after Trump with all this legal psychodrama.
Right. Part of this conversation, though, is something that we talked about off the top of the show. I made that quotation from President Trump about space, and this is a segue into one of your other books called Winning Space: How America Remains a Superpower. This has a role to play in all of this, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Because this is the new frontier. My understanding is that and this is in your book. I read this one. It was a very fascinating and unique book.
Thank you.
I was not familiar with really any of this, and I love learning new stuff. But here, when Donald Trump announced the creation of America's sixth branch of the military, the United States Space Force, many in Washington scoffed. But U.S. rivals in China, Russia, Iran, that we're going to talk about, and North Korea took notice. Why? Why is the space the final frontier? Pardon the pun. Why is this so important in this whole geopolitical game?
Well, so as I say in the book, space is the ultimate strategic high ground. Okay, and throughout history and warfare, whoever held the high ground usually was able to dominate, the battle. For us to be a modern military force, we need to project power over vast distances. Our base, of course, is North America, which is far removed from Eurasia, particularly if we're talking about the Indo-Pacific, which is geographically a much greater expanse of territory to cover. So you need satellites for pinpoint navigation. You need it for instantaneous communication. You need it for basically taking a military that, like ours, highly advanced, but yet is relatively small. It's an expeditionary force. Less than 1% of the U.S. population is in the military, and of that 1%, a very small fraction actually are deployed in combat. So what gives them advantages over larger foes is technology and integration through satellites.
Right.
And so our enemies have figured that out. And they figured out that space is the sine qua non, that which cannot be without, for the U.S. and Canadian militaries to operate effectively. And yet those systems have been left dangerously vulnerable to attack and disruption. Mm-hmm. And so for the cost of a few $1 million, an anti-satellite kill vehicle or a laser or co-orbital satellite, which is a small satellite with grappling arms that latches on to one of our systems and physically pushes them out of the way so that they're rendered inoperable. For a few $1 million, these are relatively cheap methods. Counter space is what it's called. They can basically, in about half an hour, deprive the United States of its access to space in a conflict. And what that will do is that will render U.S. and Canadian and NATO and Japanese and all the allied forces on Earth deaf, dumb, and blind. And in that strategic chaos, a country like China, which would be fighting closer to its territory over, say, Taiwan, would be able to very easily step forth and sort of methodically enact its vicious plan while the Americans and their allies were still scrambling, trying to figure out why they're deaf, dumb, and blind. And so those satellites are key. And beyond that, in winning space, that's the near term. But the longer term is, even if there is no space Pearl Harbor, which is what I hope we can avoid, even without that, there is a new space race, notably between the United States and China. It's not just to take pretty pictures from the moon and to plant a flag on Mars. That's only part of it. It's to stay in those places. It's to put boots on the moon, boots on Mars, to put systems in the asteroid belt. Why? Because of space mining. And so the
Oh,
flag, I'm a geopolitical guy by training. That's what I did at the Institute of World Politics. I was geostrategy. The flag follows trade. And so the space mining sector is the wave of the future. It will be, by the middle of this century, I believe, the dominant industry for Earth. And whoever is the first mover in that industry will have significant economic
wow.
gains, but also significant strategic advantages. And China wants to dominate the space mining
Wow,
industry.
that is really fascinating. So let's finish off this way. Are there any books that you would recommend, not necessarily your own work, that would enhance people's understanding of the work that you do, or do you think is perhaps just a very important book that people could read to get a better sense of your work and the important things that we're facing geopolitically?
Yeah, there's quite a few. The best, and I wouldn't say I'm the best, but I would say a decent writer is a great reader. And so I have definitely read a lot of books. In terms of, I'm actually in the middle of one right now. It's Orlando Fige's new
Sure.
book. He's a Russia expert. It's called The Story of Russia, and it's a very readable, brisk but powerful history of Russia. My colleague at the Asia Times, David P. Goldman, has a book, You Will Be Assimilated, which is all about China's push to dominate the Fourth Industrial Revolution. There's so many books out there that I have had the pleasure of reading, and the authors I've actually had the pleasure of getting to know, that it's too many to count. But I would say those are some good ones to start with, definitely.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Brandon, I know that you're very active writing. You have your own website.
You would find a lot of them at the WeichertReport.com.
Mm-hmm.
Admittedly, I've stopped updating it about 6 months ago. But if you were to just Google my name, you will find where I write.
Yes.
And follow me on Twitter at @WeTheBrandon. I'm a unfortunately, prolific tweeter. And have some rough elbows, I've been told, but you have to on that site. But that's definitely my website's a place you can find me, and I am going to get the Substack going eventually.
Great. Well, listen, it's been a real pleasure having you on the program.
It's been a pleasure being. Thank
I
you.
really enjoy your books, and I wish
You're
you
very kind. Thank
much
you.
continued success with everything that you're doing. And thank you so much for being our special guest today on Gray
Very
Matter.
honored.
We're going to feature your books on
Wonderful. Thank
our
you.
website. We have something called the reading list, so folks
Awesome.
will be able to find them there. And I really urge people to read them. They're brilliant. I really learned
You're
a lot
very
from
kind.
reading them.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that. That means a lot.